On a clear Sunday afternoon in September of 1944, the sky over the Netherlands transformed into a canvas of olive drab silk. To understand the chaos of that day, we must look toward the massive air armada that stretched from the English coast to the Dutch borders. How did the 101st Airborne Division maintain control of the critical Eindhoven-Arnhem highway corridor despite being surrounded and undersupplied? At 12:47 p.m., the first Pathfinders dropped onto the fields near Eerd to mark the way for the main force. One transport, piloted by Lieutenant Eugene Chauvin, was struck by 20mm anti-aircraft fire and plummeted in flames. Look at what happened when the main serials arrived over the drop zones at 1300. Major Dan Elam stayed at the controls of his burning transport to ensure his paratroopers reached the ground safely. Technical Sergeant George Ritter watched his pilot remain steady in a cockpit filled with fire before jumping into the rushing wind. The pilot, Elam, died when his aircraft crashed into a wooded area, moments after the final man exited the door. Another officer, Lieutenant Robert Stoddard Jr., also sacrificed his life to keep a crippled vessel level until his stick was clear. These burning planes were like torches lighting a path for the thousands of men still waiting to leap. High above the ground, the air was crowded with falling men and metal. Private First Class George Dockson was the last man on an aircraft called the Clay Pigeon, when it was hit by flak beneath his feet. He saw his jumpmaster, Lieutenant Tom Seibel, struck in the chest before the remaining troopers tumbled out. Dockson hesitated as the cabin filled with acrid smoke before finally leaping into the blue. His survival was one small victory in a sky filled with violence and luck. Private First Class John Vlachos observed a horrific accident when a disabled plane veered through a group of descending chutes. The heavy wing of the dying aircraft struck two paratroopers, killing them instantly before they could even touch the soil. But for those who reached the earth, the work of liberation began with a frantic assembly. Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard and the 1st Battalion of the 501st landed 3 miles from their target, near a castle in Cameron. Despite this error, the battalion marched and secured the bridges at Veghel by 1600. At the same hour, the 506th Regiment pushed toward the vital crossing at Sun. Colonel Robert Sink urged his men forward as they moved through the streets under the shadow of a German 88mm gun. Just as the lead elements reached the bank of the Wilhelmina Canal, a deafening roar signaled the bridge had been destroyed by enemy charges. Splinters and concrete rained down on Sergeant Philip Carney as the structure collapsed into the water. Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade did not hesitate and plunged into the canal to lead his men across the 80-foot span. By nightfall, the paratroopers held the banks, though the way north remained severed by the twisted iron of the sunken span. Men of the 326th Engineers toiled in the dark to construct a footbridge from salvaged planks and small boats. General Maxwell Taylor watched as his division established its first thin perimeter in a land that had forgotten the taste of freedom. The 101st had arrived, but they were now an island of soldiers in a rising sea of German resistance. As the fires of burning equipment lit the horizon, every man knew that the real struggle for the road had only just begun. Just 1 week earlier, the atmosphere in the Netherlands was heavy with a different kind of silence. To understand the fear that permeated the corridor, we must look back to the 10th of September in 1944. While the Allied armies gathered their strength in England, the occupied towns of the Netherlands watched a broken empire begin to stumble backward. The German forces were no longer the proud conquerors who had arrived 4 years earlier. Civilians like Bert Pulleys observed the roads filling with a tired and mean army in retreat. Soldiers fled on bicycles, with handcarts, and in horse-drawn vehicles of every description. In the village of Sint-Oedenrode, 13-year-old Mia van der Linden de Grief watched the Hitler Youth members passing her home. These young soldiers, some only 14 years old and wearing short trousers, robbed the local families at pistol point. One retreating German soldier carried a canteen filled with gold rings he had stolen from other victims. Consider the burden of these citizens as they watched the remnants of a retreating army discard their loot into the Dommel River. An elderly German soldier, exhausted from walking through France and Belgium, wept openly as he stopped to rest. He told the young girl that he wished the war was over because he had seen enough. But while the soldiers retreated, the occupation authorities remained determined to sabotage the land before they lost it. On Sunday, the 10th of September, German engineers used explosives to destroy the railways and the station in Eindhoven. They also blew up the ammunition and bomb dumps at the nearby airfield, sending tremors through the surrounding neighborhoods. The following morning at 3 a.m. on the 11th of September, the Dutch switchboard operators were ordered to leave their posts. Joke van Hapert Lathouwers had been working at the telephone exchange in Eindhoven under German supervision. She was a young woman who had already spent time in prison for her connection to forged documents used by downed Allied airmen. The Germans allowed her to return to work, but they kept her under close watch for 6 weeks. By mid-September, she and a small group of operators were using their access to the lines to assist the underground resistance. When they were not allowed to work in the office, these women performed dangerous courier missions. They moved through the streets as the Germans began to tighten their grip on the remaining communications hubs. On the 12th of September, the tension shifted toward the village of Sun and its vital bridge over the Wilhelmina Canal. Rumors spread through the town that the bridge would be blown up at 10 in the morning. Families began moving their belongings to the basement of the local sanitarium, seeking shelter from the expected blast. The explosion did not come that day, but the Germans began placing 88mm guns on the north side of the span. Just 2 days later, the sound of the approaching war reached the ears of the local inhabitants. A Dutch Red Cross nurse named Koos van Schaik stood in a backyard in Sint-Odenrood and felt the constant vibrations in the air. The wind was blowing from the east, bringing with it the rumble of distant artillery that sounded like a slow-approaching thunderstorm. She touched her fingertips to the glass of a window and could feel the heavy guns firing miles away to the south. Look at how the reality of liberation began to flicker like lightning on the horizon. The German surgeon at the local hospital told the staff he would go to Nijmegen to gather more supplies and food. Inside the hospital, the Dutch nurses refused to drink the tea offered to them by the German medical corpsmen. They spent their evenings huddled around a hidden radio, listening to the muffled voice of Radio Orange broadcasting from London. The signal was weak and often jammed by German interference, but it brought news that the British Second Army had broken the defence line in Belgium. On the 15th of September, the Germans intensified their search for labour. Men were rounded up on the streets and forced to dig fire trenches and tank traps at the point of a rifle. In the city of Eindhoven, the German women who operated the switchboards fled back toward their own borders. They were replaced by soldiers, and nearly all civilian telephone lines were severed. By September, the underground reported that the retreating German army was in a state of total disorder. Railroad lines were being blown up by resistance fighters to prevent the movement of enemy reinforcements. Underground members like Peter van Brevoort and his brother Tom were living in hiding on a farm in Den Dungen. They had recently escaped from a German prison bus by jumping out of an unlocked door, while the guards were looking the other way. The brothers hid in the sewer system of a city before finding shelter with a farmer who was not a traitor. While they waited in the shadows, they discovered that some of the German soldiers stationed on the local farms were older men from annexed countries. 10 of these soldiers offered to go into hiding rather than fight for a cause they no longer believed in. The resistance provided them with civilian overalls to cover their uniforms and hid them in a dugout hut. As the sun set on the 16th of September, the Dutch people in the corridor sensed that the long wait was nearly over. In the village of Sun, the people in the sanitarium basement listened to the sound of Allied reconnaissance planes circling above. The Germans had ordered the evacuation of everyone living near the canal bridge, and the streets were largely deserted. The quiet was broken only by the occasional strafing run of a fighter plane targeting the retreating columns. The inhabitants of the Netherlands knew the storm was coming, but they could not yet imagine it would descend from the clouds. A few miles to the north in the town of Eerd, a parish priest named Joseph Willemborg met with his underground cell. He was a man of great courage, who would soon play a vital role in the survival of the paratroopers. Everyone in the resistance was on alert, waiting for a signal that would tell them where to strike. The psychological weight of the occupation had reached its breaking point. Families prayed together in their cellars, while the German defenders moved their heavy guns into final positions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would turn these quiet towns into the most contested ground in Europe. The civilians watched the horizon and waited for the dawn of a day that would change their world forever. On the morning of the 18th of September, the focus of the 101st Airborne Division shifted from the open fields of the drop zones to the narrow streets leading toward Eindhoven. To navigate the hazards of the day, Colonel Robert Sink directed the 506th Regiment south, while a makeshift ferry service began moving vehicles across the canal at Son. Lieutenant Charles Santasiero led the dawn attack, punching a hole through the first lines of retreating German infantry. As the paratroopers approached the city, they were met by the heavy fire of 288mm guns positioned to sweep the cobblestone roads. The tactical situation became a house-to-house struggle, where every recessed doorway offered both a shield and a potential trap. Look at how the perspective of a soldier changes when he enters the close quarters of an urban center. Sergeant George Martin directed his mortar squads to drop rounds with high-angle precision into the German positions near the village square. One enemy projectile struck a building directly above the foxhole of Lieutenant Santazero, showering him with a cascade of hot bricks and mortar. The 2nd Battalion eventually swung around the left flank, utilizing the knowledge of local citizens to bypass the primary German strongpoints. By early afternoon, the center of Eindhoven was filled with a frantic sea of orange flags and celebrating civilians. Citizens offered pitchers of beer and thin ham sandwiches to the dirty, exhausted men who had just cleared their streets of the occupation forces. But the celebration was a brief pause in a campaign that was becoming more lethal by the hour. While the 506th held the city, the 502nd Regiment was engaged in a vicious struggle for the highway bridge, near the town of Best. The German defenders had reinforced the sector with a battalion of infantry and multiple anti-aircraft batteries that defoliated the surrounding pine forests. On the afternoon of the 18th, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole was struck down by a sniper while he was in an open field attempting to signal friendly fighter planes with an orange panel. His death was a staggering blow to the 3rd Battalion, occurring just as the arrival of British tanks began to turn the tide in the woods. By the morning of Friday, the 22nd of September, the German command launched its most coordinated attempt to sever the lifeline of the Allied advance. This day became known to the local inhabitants and the soldiers alike as Black Friday. Elements of the 107th Panzer Brigade pushed from the east, striking the town of Veghel with heavy armor and concentrated artillery. The enemy fire was so intense that shells frequently struck the local convent and the hospital where the wounded were being treated. Corporal Rogie Roberts of the 81st Anti-Tank Battalion found himself in the middle of a smoke-filled street as a German Panther tank rumbled within 100 yards of his gun. The air was thick with the scent of burning fuel and the constant rattle of small arms fire hitting the nearby brick walls. Roberts fired his 57mm piece, striking the tank between its tracks and causing the massive machine to erupt in a pillar of black smoke. Despite these individual acts of bravery, the German pressure succeeded in cutting the highway at Coevering, effectively isolating the northern elements of the division. The 101st was now fighting a battle on two fronts, struggling to clear the road while holding off armored thrusts from the surrounding marshes. As the sun set on the 22nd of September, the corridor was a graveyard of burning transport trucks and twisted iron. Following the chaotic struggle to hold the bridges at Veghel, a different kind of war began to take shape in the sand dunes near the village of Eerd. By the morning of the 23rd of September, the 1st and 3rd Battalions of the 501st Regiment found themselves retracing their steps through a landscape that had become a patchwork of small victories and sudden ambushes. To understand the nature of this theatre, one must see the topography of the Eerd Dunes, where the horizon was dominated by a single Dutch windmill and shifting piles of sand that rose 30 feet above the flat pastures. The men moved back into these positions during a cold, damp night, feeling the weight of their equipment and the creeping fatigue of a week spent in constant contact with the enemy. Early the following morning, the German infantry utilized the morning mist to filter into the high ground of the dunes, establishing an observation post that allowed them to look directly down into the village. Sergeant Guy Sessions of Company C watched as the enemy advanced steadily through a nearby berm of pine trees, coming close enough for the adversaries to shout challenges across the narrow gaps in the brush. A German 88mm gun zeroed in on the Eerd windmill, methodically dismantling the brick structure while paratroopers used its height to direct their own mortar fire. In the midst of this barrage, Captain Harry Howard climbed into the shattered church steeple to replace the fallen observers and direct the fire of the 81mm tubes. Imagine the defiance of an officer who, after being nearly buried by falling masonry, returned to the heights that evening to hang an American flag in the opening of the ruined tower. The Germans responded the next morning by leveling the remainder of the spire with heavy artillery. But the psychological message of the paratroopers had already been delivered to the surrounding countryside. Just 1 week later, the tactical focus of the 101st Airborne Division shifted north as the men were ordered to move onto the narrow strip of land known as the Island. This region sat between the Niederrhein and the Waal River, a water-soaked expanse where the low-lying fields were protected from the currents by a network of massive earthen dikes. By the 3rd of October, the paratroopers began relieving British units who had been holding the southern bank of the Rhine for weeks. Life in these trenches was defined by the smell of damp wool, the taste of cold rations, and the constant, intimate proximity of the German defenders. To understand the claustrophobia of this front, you must picture a road where the enemy is only the width of a pavement away. The soldiers were dug into the leeward side of the dikes, while the Germans occupied the opposite slope, sometimes close enough for the men to hear each other coughing or clearing their throats in the dark. This proximity led to the development of a unique and lethal form of combat that the men called the grenade court, because the steep sides of the dike caused standard hand grenades to roll harmlessly to the bottom before exploding. The paratroopers began to improvise. Sergeant Lawrence Lamb and other ingenious soldiers unraveled silk threads from parachute suspension lines and tied them to the drawstring caps of their grenades. By measuring the length of the cord to match the width of the road, they could drop their explosives precisely into the German foxholes, without the canisters rolling away. While the soldiers perfected these small-scale duels, the local Dutch citizens became an essential part of the division's daily survival. A member of the underground resistance named Bill Van Whaley assisted the Americans by guiding patrols through the labyrinth of irrigation ditches that crisscrossed the local farms. He watched as the paratroopers dug into his family's land, placing machine guns at the edge of his barn and turning the kitchen into a temporary command post. The reality of the war hit home when the paratroopers, hungry and short on supplies, utilized the family's flock of 50 chickens for a fresh meal. Look at the frustration of a local farmer who returned to find his mother's carefully raised pullets being prepared as drumsticks, only to have the dinner interrupted by a sudden German mortar attack. As the shells began to fall, Van Whaley fled with the soldiers into a dry ditch, seeking cover while the enemy walked their rounds down the line of the orchards. The German artillery was exceptionally accurate in this sector, as they occupied the high ground of the hills across the river and could see every vehicle that moved in daylight. On the 6th of October, the 501st Regiment suffered a staggering blow when a single shell struck near a group of officers who were inspecting the lines. Colonel Howard Johnson, the charismatic and unpredictable commander of the regiment, was mortally wounded by shrapnel during the blast. As he lay on the ground, he spoke his final words to the men gathered around him, asking them to take care of his boys. His death cast a long shadow over the regiment, which had come to define itself through his aggressive and independent style of leadership. The following days on the island settled into a rhythm of sniping and night patrols, where the silence was often more terrifying than the noise of the guns. The men occupied abandoned farmhouses during the daylight hours, staying away from the windows to avoid attracting the attention of the 88mm batteries across the water. At night, they moved back to the dikes to man the listening posts and watch for German assault boats attempting to cross the river under the cover of the fog. Flares were fired at regular intervals, bathing the Rhine in a ghostly light that revealed the silhouettes of rubber boats and the churning of the current. Despite the constant pressure, a quiet camaraderie developed between the soldiers and the few civilians who remained in the basements of their shell-torn homes. Gifts of apples and milk were traded for cigarettes, creating small pockets of humanity in a landscape that was rapidly being consumed by fire and iron. By the middle of October, the division had established a firm hold on its sector of the island, maintaining a vigilant watch over the river that separated them from the remains of the German army. The paratroopers had learned to live with the cold and the mud, waiting for the order that would finally move them toward a place of rest. As the sun set on the 15th of October, the men on the dike adjusted their scarves, made of parachute silk, and prepared for another long night of looking across the water. By the 16th of October, the landscape of the Netherlands had surrendered to a persistent, bone-chilling rain. To understand the psychological weight of those final weeks, you must see the exhaustion in the eyes of the men who had occupied the front lines for over a month. The town of Ophieston had become a hollow wasteland of shell-shattered houses and silent orchards. One day, the American command decided to attempt a unique form of psychological warfare by utilizing large loudspeakers to coax the enemy into surrendering. The plan called for the paratroopers to open fire with every available weapon for a concentrated period, followed by an abrupt, absolute silence to let the broadcasted message be heard. One machine gunner noted the absurdity of the scene when his overheated weapon continued to fire single rounds, even after he had removed his hands from the trigger. The high-pitched mechanical stutter of that lone gun was the only sound in the sudden quiet, while an officer on the loudspeaker threatened the unseen Germans with total annihilation. During the same afternoon, a team of photographers and journalists from Life magazine arrived on the scene to document the capturing of prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel Alan Ginder attempted to escort the reporters through a wooded area near the front when he was struck by a bullet in the lower abdomen. The journalists, who were unaccustomed to the raw violence of the island, watched in horror as the officer was carried away with a shattered pelvic bone. 1 week later, on the cold night of the 23rd of October, the division participated in one of the most daring rescue operations of the war. Colonel Robert Sink coordinated with a red-bearded British colonel named Doby to retrieve over 100 Allied soldiers trapped behind enemy lines. These men, mostly British paratroopers who had escaped capture after the battle for Arnhem, had been hidden in Dutch homes and barns for weeks by the local resistance. The rescue party utilized 14 small canvas assault boats to cross the churning waters of the Neder Rhine under the cover of a massive artillery box barrage. Listen to the tension of that crossing, where the only signal to move was a single red light flashing from the occupied northern bank. The paratroopers successfully ferried approximately 140 people, including several American pilots and members of the Dutch underground. As the calendar turned toward November, the static nature of the front began to drain the remaining strength of the division. The men were living in a constant state of dampness, where clothes never dried and the mud of the lowlands seemed to permeate everything they owned. On the 23rd of November, which was Thanksgiving Day for the Americans, the German artillery launched a heavy barrage against the division command post at Slik-Uwijk. Heavy artillery struck the command post, blowing one man out of a barn and damaging the signal company's quarters, throwing men across the room and destroying vital communication equipment. The division commander, General Maxwell Taylor, had returned to duty by this time after recovering from a shrapnel wound sustained earlier in the campaign. By the 25th of November, the order finally arrived for the 101st Airborne Division to be relieved by British units and moved toward France. The soldiers packed their bedrolls and marched away from the dikes, leaving behind the fields that they had held for 72 consecutive days. To understand the significance of this endurance, consider that no other American division had ever spent so long in continuous contact with the enemy during a single operation. As the truck convoys moved south through the corridor, the Dutch civilians lined the roads of Veghel and Eindhoven to shout the date of their liberation. The central question of how a surrounded and undersupplied division held this highway is answered by the stubborn grit of individual squads who refused to yield a single irrigation ditch. Their success was built on the silent support of the Dutch people and the flexible small unit tactics that allowed them to repulse armored divisions with little more than bazookas and rifles. When the paratroopers arrived at their new garrison in Moermellen-le-Grand, the transition to peacetime routine felt like a dream. Practicing the precise discipline of model soldiering, General Maxwell Taylor would later lead the division into the frozen forests of Bastogne, while Colonel Robert Sink continued to command his regiment through the final push into Germany. The legacy of their time in Holland is preserved each year at the military cemetery in Margraten, where thousands of Dutch children place flowers on the graves of the men who fell. The final image of the campaign is not a map or a monument, but the face of a young Dutch girl who handed a paratrooper an ice cream sandwich during the initial march into Veghel. We hope this exploration of the Holland campaign has provided a deeper understanding of the men who held Hell's Highway. If your family has stories from the airborne divisions or the European theatre of the Second World War, we invite you to share those memories in the comments below. Please consider subscribing and liking this video to help us tell more of these essential stories from our history. Grateful for your time and your interest in the legacy of the greatest generation.